What if one of the most epic stories ever told isn't just a story? For thousands of years, the Exodus has echoed through temples, synagogues, churches, and cultures across the globe. It shaped nations, inspired revolutions, and became a symbol of deliverance for countless generations. And yet, beneath all of that power and poetry lies a burning question. Did it truly happen? Tonight, we return to the dawn of civilization, to shifting sands and shattered kingdoms, to half-erased inscriptions and forgotten corridors of history. And we ask, with open minds and steady curiosity, is there evidence that an entire people once walked out of Egypt into the desert and into the pages of history? For most of my life, I believed the Exodus was simply a captivating tale, a moral epic about freedom and faith. But then, the ground shifted. I began diving into ancient records, dusty tablets, obscure archaeological digs, and unexpected inscriptions. And the deeper I dug, the more I realized that the truth may be far stranger, far older, and far more complex than we were taught. What if the clues have been hiding in plain sight? What if the ancient world still whispers the story, only in fragments, scattered across continents, waiting for us to piece them together? Tonight, travel with me across deserts, through ruins, and into the heart of antiquity, as we retrace the real Exodus, retracing an ancient journey. Chapter 1. The myth, the legend, the challenge, the Exodus. For more than 3,000 years, it has stood as one of the most powerful stories ever told. The cry of an oppressed people, the defiance of a tyrant, the breathtaking escape across a wilderness that still whispers their journey. It is a story woven into the spiritual DNA of billions, a narrative of liberation, hope, and the unbreakable will to be free. But in the quiet chambers of archaeology, history, and critical scholarship, another narrative unfolds, one filled with questions, debates, and mysteries that refuse to rest. Tonight, we open the doors to that other narrative. Imagine standing at the edge of the Nile thousands of years ago. The air thick with heat, the sky glowing gold. Egypt, the mightiest empire of its time, rising and towering temples and sprawling cities. And somewhere within this empire, the earliest whispers of the Exodus story were born. Yet when modern archaeologists sift through the sands for traces of this monumental event, they find almost nothing. No campsites of a wandering nation, no inscriptions describing a sudden loss of slaves, no Egyptian tablet lamenting plagues or miracles. Just silence, a silence that has puzzled researchers for generations. But silence is not proof of absence. Not in a world where time buries everything and fragile stories easily vanish beneath shifting earth. So our journey begins with a challenge, a tension between a story revered across centuries and a landscape that has long refused to confirm it. As we enter this ancient riddle, let us sink deeper into the world where the Exodus was said to unfold. A world that was far more complex, far more volatile, and far more dynamic than most imagine. Because understanding this world is the key to unlocking the mystery. Picture Egypt near the end of the Bronze Age. Kingdoms rose and fell like waves against a restless shore. Empires that once seemed eternal found themselves shaken by droughts, invasions, rebellions, and economic collapse. Across the Middle East, stability cracked like drying mud. The foundations of an era trembled. In this swirling chaos, even the mightiest records could vanish. Entire cities disappeared with barely a trace. Armies marched, fought, and died without inscriptions to immortalize them. And populations moved across deserts and valleys, leaving footprints that wind and time erased. Into this background of instability, the Exodus story enters history, not as an isolated tale, but as part of a much larger web of collapse. Some scholars argue that the story is far too elaborate and dramatic to have emerged from nothing. They suggest it must reflect fragments of real memories, memories of oppression, memories of movement, memories of a people shaped by struggle. Others believe the story reflects a metaphorical truth, not a literal one. A mythic retelling of cultural identity, not a record of historical events. And still others stand somewhere between those extremes, proposing that the Exodus might be a blend of both, real events layered with symbolic meaning, woven together through centuries of storytelling. As we walk through this debate, we begin to see the Exodus not as a simple yes or no question, but as a living mosaic, a puzzle with pieces scattered across scrolls, ruins, and oral traditions. Let us travel further into the minds of the ancient scribes who wrote the biblical narrative. They were not historians in the modern sense. They were storytellers, theologians, poets, and archivists of identity. They wrote to preserve meaning, not to satisfy future archaeologists. They wove events, traditions, and memories together to answer deeper questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? Why did we survive when so many great nations fell? In this light, the Exodus takes on new life as both history and homeland, fact and foundation, memory and mythos. But if the story contains kernels of real events, where are they? To answer that, we must turn to the earliest written clues available to us. Fragments of Egyptian texts that hint, faintly, indirectly, at disruptions, collapses, and uprisings. Records of laborers, foreign groups, and enslaved populations that lived and worked within Egyptian society. We begin with the fact that Egypt was home to countless foreigners, traders, nomads, laborers, and captives taken in war. Many came willingly, seeking food and stability. Others were forced into service. It is entirely plausible that some of these groups later merged into what would become early Israelite identity. And yet, Egypt rarely recorded embarrassment. Pharaohs did not carve defeats into stone. They did not immortalize their losses. Their inscriptions were works of propaganda, crafted to glorify the king, never to shame him. This alone raises a critical point. If an Exodus-like departure occurred, Egypt would have had little reason to record it. So the silence might not be mysterious at all. It might be expected. But scholars push further. They ask, if not records, then where are the physical traces? The campsites, the pottery, the remains of a nation in motion? The answer is sobering. Nomadic groups leave little behind. Most of what they carried was biodegradable: leather, cloth, wood. Their temporary camps vanished under centuries of sand. Their footprints were swallowed by shifting desert dunes. Their brief fires left ashes that dispersed into nothing. And so we stand between myth and archaeology, between story and silence. This is the true challenge of the Exodus. It invites us to step beyond simple categories, to embrace uncertainty, to walk through layers of interpretation and evidence, to consider both the known and the unknown. As we dive deeper into this mystery, we encounter scholars who defend the historicity of the Exodus with passion. They point to linguistic clues, cultural memories, and ancient traditions that seem too persistent to be inventions. They argue that the story bears marks of authenticity, details that a later author would not invent without access to older sources. And we meet those who argue the opposite, that the Exodus is a symbolic origin story, crafted to give meaning to emerging Israelite identity during a time of transformation. Between these voices, our exploration continues, because the power of this journey does not lie in choosing a side. It lies in understanding the full spectrum of possibilities. So we turn now to the heart of the question. What can the ancient world actually tell us? What whispers survive beneath the sands? What fragments reveal glimpses of a forgotten journey? In the chapters to come, we will walk through deserts where ancient travelers once moved. We will sift through dusty scrolls and inscriptions. We will encounter the earliest mentions of the people called Israel. We will explore alternate theories, from small-scale migrations to complex cultural merges. We will look at routes believed to be traveled, seas believed to have parted, mountains believed to have echoed with ancient footsteps. But before we leave this chapter behind, let us anchor ourselves in one final thought. The Exodus endures not because of inscriptions or artifacts, but because it speaks to something timeless. The longing for freedom, the courage to resist oppression, the faith that journeys into the unknown are worth taking. Unearthing ancient echoes. Step with me now into the deep twilight of the late Bronze Age, a world trembling on the edge of collapse. Imagine the lands of Egypt and the Levant not as the still, quiet deserts we know today, but as vibrant regions pulsing with trade, conflict, ambition, and unrest. Caravans move like slow trains across the dunes. War chariots thunder across plains. Temples rise like mountains of stone, casting long shadows over the people who served them. This is the world in which the echoes of the Exodus first begin to shimmer into view, faint, elusive, and scattered like shards of pottery across the desert. To understand the possibility of a real Exodus, we must build a bridge between the biblical narrative and the fragile relics of history that remain. And so we begin to sift the sands for ancient clues, not for complete stories, but for fragments, hints, whispers. Let us begin with a single fragile artifact, a tattered scroll known today as the Ipuwer papyrus. Written in poetic lament, it describes a time of chaos in Egypt. Rivers turning red, servants fleeing, disorder sweeping over the land. Scholars caution us, these may be metaphors common in ancient Egyptian literature, not literal accounts, but symbolic expressions of social breakdown. Yet others cannot help but wonder, why does this imagery echo so closely the plagues described in the Exodus? Coincidence? Literary convention? Or memory, distant and distorted, of real calamities that rippled through the empire? We do not jump to conclusions. We simply hold the fragment up to the light and listen. Next, we turn to a stone carved decades later, the Merneptah stele. Upon its black, polished surface, Pharaoh Merneptah boasts of victories across Canaan. He lists cities and tribes he claims to have subdued. And among these names, carved in quiet authority, are the words, "Israel is laid waste." This is the earliest known written mention of Israel. But notice carefully, Israel is not described as a city or a kingdom, but as a people, a group, a community on the land. Who were these people? How long had they been there? Where had they come from? This inscription does not prove an exodus, but it proves something crucial. By around 1208 BCE, a people identifiable as Israel already existed in the hills of Canaan. If they were already there, when did they arrive? Did they rise from within Canaan itself? Or did they arrive from somewhere else? Perhaps Egypt. Thus begins our journey into the heart of ancient echoes. We move now deeper into the archaeological landscape of the late Bronze Age. We observe the ruins of once great cities, Hazor, Lachish, Megiddo. Many of these were destroyed or abandoned around the same period the Exodus might have occurred. Some fell to war, some to internal revolt, some to famine or shift in alliances. This era is known as the Bronze Age collapse, a time when entire civilizations crumbled in fire and silence. Kingdoms that stood for centuries vanished in decades. Trade networks disintegrated, populations scattered. It was into this world of upheaval that the earliest ancestors of Israel may have emerged. Some archaeologists propose that the Israelites were not foreigners escaping Egypt, but rather Canaanites who broke away from the collapsing city-states. They point to pottery styles, settlement patterns, and architectural remains that appear deeply rooted in local culture. Others argue that this picture is incomplete. They note sudden changes in diet, language, and burial customs that suggest the arrival of outsiders, people who may have carried memories of servitude in Egypt. And still others suggest a hybrid origin, a merging of migrants from Egypt with rural Canaanite groups fleeing instability. To hold these theories in balance, we must keep exploring. As we walk through the desert ruins of Sinai, we find inscriptions left by miners and laborers. Not biblical characters, but ordinary workers, Egyptians, Canaanites, and wandering Semitic groups known broadly as Asiatics. These inscriptions prove something vital. Semitic peoples lived, traveled, and worked in and around Egypt for centuries. They crossed borders. They served as soldiers, artisans, slaves, and shepherds. Some settled permanently, some returned home, some disappeared into the vast desert frontier. In this reality, the idea of a group leaving Egypt is not far-fetched at all. In fact, it may have happened many times in many ways. Our task is to understand whether one of those departures eventually shaped the Exodus tradition. We then turn to small shards of pottery found at remote desert sites. Some are crude, broken, nearly unidentifiable. Yet even these fragments speak. They tell of temporary encampments, small groups traveling lightly through the wilderness, leaving traces too faint to mark confidently as Israelite, but too human to ignore. As we peer deeper into the desert, another piece of evidence emerges: the discovery of short-lived settlements. Scattered across the highlands of Canaan during the 12th and 11th centuries BCE, these settlements appear suddenly, new villages on hilltops previously uninhabited, hundreds of them springing up like sparks across the landscape. Many scholars believe these settlements mark the birth of early Israelite society. But where did these new settlers come from? Some believe they were local Canaanites seeking refuge from collapsing city-states. But others see hints of outsider influence, differences in diet, housing, and cultural symbols that do not fully match the surrounding region. The question deepens. We then turn to an even more controversial but intriguing artifact, the Admonitions of Epur, another text describing societal upheaval, servants fleeing their masters, foreign groups rising, chaos sweeping the land. Though not a historical report, it nonetheless paints a picture of Egypt during times when mass departures may have occurred. Into this tapestry of collapse, slavery, flight, famine, and migration, the Exodus story might fit, not as a single monumental event, but as a concentrated memory of many such movements. And then we approach one of the most heated debates of all. If hundreds of thousands left Egypt and wandered for 40 years, where are their remains? Archaeologists respond with clarity. Deserts are cruel archivists. Nomadic societies leave almost nothing behind. Wood, cloth, leather, rope, all disappear. Footprints are swallowed by shifting sands. Temporary mud or reed shelters crumble in months. A camp of thousands could vanish in a single generation of wind. Even in modern times, large traveling communities leave almost no archaeological trace after only a few years. This does not prove the Exodus, but it does explain why its absence in the desert is not surprising. Now we turn to Egyptian records themselves. Though sparse, they include depictions of Semitic peoples working as slaves, constructing cities, carrying bricks and tools. The biblical claim that the Israelites built cities like pyramises may hold a glimmer of truth, not as a specific record, but as a memory of labor forces composed of Semitic workers. Indeed, Pyramises was a real city, a massive, bustling capital of Ramses II. When it was abandoned generations later, its stones were used to build other cities, erasing much of its footprint. Any records of laborers who built or maintained it could have vanished with time or political revision. Another echo emerges from archaeology, a group known as the Hyksos, Semitic rulers who once controlled northern Egypt. When they were expelled, some fled east toward Canaan. Their story, though centuries earlier, may have contributed ancestral memories of Semitic people leaving Egypt under pressure. Not the Exodus, but perhaps a precursor memory woven into later tradition. As these echoes gather, a fascinating picture begins to form. A world in turmoil, a landscape filled with migrating communities. Semitic peoples living within Egypt, others fleeing, others returning home. Empires collapsing, cities burning, villages rising in the hills of Canaan. Into this chaos, a powerful story could easily take root, a story of liberation, escape, and divine intervention. Whether the biblical narrative reflects one group's journey, or a woven memory of many movements, remains a question still explored by scholars around the world. As we near the end of this chapter, let us reflect on the weight of what we've uncovered. The Exodus may not be a singular documented event. It may be a tapestry, tightly woven, deeply layered, and drawn from multiple ancient experiences. It may be the collective memory of people who once walked the borders of Egypt, people who lived under its shadow, people who fled its reach, people who carried the memory of oppression and deliverance as they formed a new identity in the rugged highlands of Canaan. And while the sands may hide the physical path they walked, the echoes remain, preserved in texts, inscriptions, and the shifting patterns of ancient settlement. These echoes are faint, but they are real, and they guide us toward the heart of the mystery. Chapter 3: The Paths Less Traveled. 1 hour of continuous narration, voiceover only. The Exodus story is, at its core, a journey, a movement across shifting landscapes, hostile terrain, vast water, and a wilderness that has challenged travelers for thousands of years. To understand the possibility of a real Exodus, we must step into those landscapes ourselves, not through imagination alone, but through geography, archaeology, and the enduring marks left upon the land. Tonight, we walk the paths. We trace the routes proposed across centuries of scholarship. We listen to the stories told not by texts, but by mountains, seas, winds, and stone. We begin in the land of Egypt, in the northeastern delta, where lush greenery meets slow-moving rivers. The biblical narrative places the Israelites in the land of Goshen, a fertile region known for pastures and labor. This region, archaeologically speaking, was home to many Semitic peoples during the 2nd millennium BCE. They lived, worked, traded, and in some cases served as forced laborers under Egyptian authority. Already the land begins whispering its connections. From here, scholars have proposed several potential exit points. Some routes travel northeast toward Canaan, others turn south. Others veer eastward across desert expanses toward the Sinai Peninsula. Each route carries with it a different theory, a different interpretation, a different landscape of evidence and silence. Let us walk slowly, thoughtfully, along each of these paths. The first path leads toward the northern route, just south of the Mediterranean coastline. This path would take travelers through a region once fortified with Egyptian military outposts, known collectively as the Way of Horus. Towers, fortresses, supply depots, and wells line this coastal strip. Archaeologists have uncovered remnants of these structures, strongholds built to control the entry and exit of people. If a mass group attempted to flee Egypt through this northern path, they would almost certainly encounter these fortifications. They would be intercepted, confronted, or recorded in some manner. This fact has led many scholars to doubt the northern route, yet others propose exceptions, moments of political instability, shifts in military presence, or environmental factors that may have weakened control along this border. Still, the northern path remains difficult to reconcile with the idea of a large, unmonitored departure, and so we turn southward, toward the central Sinai route, where the land stretches into rolling dunes and rocky plains. This route blends into a network of ancient trails used by traders, nomads, and shepherds since time immemorial. Here, the ground is harsh and unforgiving, water is scarce, vegetation sporadic. But it is also a land where small groups can disappear easily, beyond the eyes of any empire. This central path aligns closely with the wilderness terrain described in the Exodus narrative, a landscape of dryness, barrenness, and intense isolation. Archaeologists have discovered temporary settlements, fire pits, and stone circles throughout the central Sinai. None can be linked directly to the Exodus, yet all demonstrate that nomadic groups moved through this region constantly, leaving faint and fleeting traces. Then we turn even further south, toward the southern Sinai route, the most dramatic and rugged of all. This route winds through jagged mountain ranges, steep canyons, and narrow passages carved by time. It leads toward the towering granite peaks often associated with Mount Sinai. In this southern landscape, the silence is profound. No major cities once stood here. No armies patrolled these heights. This is a land that swallows footprints, shelters nomads, and erases entire histories in the blink of a century. It is here that tradition has long placed the revelation of the Ten Commandments. Whether symbolic or literal, the mountains of southern Sinai stand as ancient sentinels, witnesses to journeys long forgotten. But even these mountains hold secrets, and they speak to us in unexpected ways. Archaeologists exploring this region have found inscriptions in Proto-Sinaitic script, the earliest alphabetic script known. Some of these inscriptions appear to have been carved by Semitic laborers working in Egyptian turquoise mines. Though not evidence of the Exodus itself, they prove that Semitic groups lived and toiled in this region. Could some of these workers or their descendants have contributed to the Exodus tradition? The possibility lingers in the desert air. Now let us return to the central question. Where did the Exodus crossing occur? What was the Red Sea? What was the Sea of Reeds? What body of water could a fleeing population encounter that might block their path, then open, then close again? The term used in the ancient Hebrew texts, Yam Suf, does not necessarily refer to the deep waters of the modern Red Sea. Many scholars interpret it as Sea of Reeds, likely referring to marshlands, lakes, or lagoons in the eastern Nile Delta region or northern Sinai. Let us consider several possibilities. First, the Bitter Lakes region, a chain of shallow lakes and marshes that once stretched across the northeastern delta. History shows these lakes were profoundly influenced by winds and tides. Under certain conditions, strong winds blowing across shallow waters can cause a phenomenon known as wind set-down, temporarily exposing land beneath the water. When the wind stops, the waters return rapidly. Could an event like this have been remembered, magnified, and passed down as the parting of a sea? The geography allows for this possibility. Another proposed location is Lake Bala, once connected to the ancient Nile and subject to seasonal flooding. A sudden shift in water levels could trap or drown pursuing forces. The land here changes shape over centuries. Channels open, lakes shrink, marshes move. What we see today is not what once existed. A third possibility is the Gulf of Suez, though this is debated due to its depth and scale. Yet geological studies show that ancient shorelines have dramatically shifted. Earthquakes, tsunamis, and tectonic movement may once have altered this region in ways we can no longer fully reconstruct. And then there is the traditional view, a crossing of the northern reaches of the Red Sea proper. If such a crossing occurred, it would require either a rare natural phenomenon or an event remembered through the lens of sacred storytelling. Whichever body of water the ancient narrative refers to, the crossing is described as a symbolic moment, a boundary between slavery and freedom, between an old identity and a new one. Now we move beyond water and into the wilderness. The Exodus narrative describes sites with ancient names: Mara, Elim, Rephidim, Sinai, Paran, Zin. Over centuries, scholars have attempted to match these names to real locations on maps, yet no consensus has emerged. Some places have multiple candidates. Others may no longer exist. Still others may reflect lost names, merged traditions, or symbolic geography rather than literal coordinates. This does not diminish their significance. Instead, it reveals the layered nature of ancient memory. A powerful moment unfolds when we examine potential mountain candidates for Mount Sinai. There is Jebel Musa, the traditional site where monasteries now stand. There's Jebel al-Lawz, located in northwestern Arabia, proposed by some as the true Sinai, though evidence remains disputed. There are mountains deep in southern Sinai, whose peaks rise sharply into the sky, isolated and awe-inspiring. Which mountain is the mountain? The land keeps its secrets. As we trace these routes, something remarkable emerges. None of the paths are impossible. None contradict the desert's geography. None break the rules of nature or ancient travel. What we find instead is a landscape filled with potential pathways, each one plausible, each one capable of supporting a journey of hardship and transformation. But now we must turn to a central puzzle. If a large population traveled through this wilderness, where are the remains? The desert answers with its timeless quiet. Nomadic groups do not leave monuments. They do not carve their names into stone. They do not bury their dead in lasting tombs. They live lightly, move constantly, and vanish before the sands. Archaeological studies show that even modern Bedouin encampments far more recent leave virtually no trace after only a few years. Time erases their presence almost completely, and so the absence of archaeological evidence does not prove absence of movement. It simply reflects the nature of nomadic life. Yet the Exodus' story is more than a physical journey. It is a cultural journey, one that scholars now believe may reflect multiple migrations, multiple memories, layered through centuries of storytelling. Perhaps some groups fled Egypt. Perhaps others rose from within Canaan. Perhaps still others were displaced during the Bronze Age collapse. Over time, their stories merged into one great narrative of liberation. As our hour errs toward its final moments, the desert landscape opens before us once more. Wide, vast, mysterious. The sun sinks low across quiet ridges. Stones glow with fading warmth. The air grows still. Through this silence, one truth becomes clear. The Exodus roots, whether northern, central, or southern, represent possibilities, not certainties. They are windows into a world where people moved constantly, seeking survival, freedom, and identity. And while we may never pinpoint the exact road, we can understand the kind of journey that shaped the memory. A journey through barriers and boundaries. A journey through fear and uncertainty. A journey towards something new. Chapter 4. Beyond the sands, the data speaks. Science often feels like the language of certainty, a realm of numbers, calibrations, and measurements. But when we try to apply science to something as ancient, elusive, and myth-shrouded as the Exodus, the journey becomes far more complex than simply collecting evidence. It becomes a search for echoes left behind in soil, in stone, in decayed pigments, in genomes, and in the very dust that once bore the footprints of forgotten peoples. And tonight, we immerse ourselves in that search, stepping beyond stories, beyond traditions, beyond sands, and into the hard data that now speaks a language all its own. When archaeologists pull samples from ancient layers of desert sediment, what they're searching for isn't just objects. They're searching for patterns, clusters of activity, disruptions in settlement, signs of human presence where none should be, or absence where there should be many. And in the case of the possible Exodus, science begins whispering long before artifacts appear. We begin with radiocarbon dating, the technique that has rewritten timelines across the ancient world. Every charred grain of barley, every dried reed basket, every collapsed beam of a long-buried dwelling carries with it a time-stamped pan-atomic signature of when it last lived or breathed. And in the late Bronze Age, these timestamps often reveal upheaval. Sites that thrive for centuries suddenly show destruction layers. Settlements vanish from historical records. The entire population seemed to shift, as if something stirred the region, pushing groups outward, pulling others inward. In the Nile Delta, radiocarbon sequences show fluctuations in population centers, villages expanding and contracting across brief time periods, almost as if communities were being mobilized or displaced. In the highlands of Canaan, the same dating reveals a surge in small, new settlements around the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Many of these humble structures lack the pottery styles typical of the established Canaanite cities. Their architecture is simpler, their layouts distinct, their material culture faintly different. To some scholars, these sites hint at new arrivals, small groups migrating gradually into the region, establishing a foothold where none had existed. If there was a historical event that later became the seed of the Exodus story, its imprint may not lie in Egyptian sands, but in these highland villages, scattered like the first quiet notes of a cultural transformation. Beyond radiocarbon dating, geology adds another layer to the conversation. The Exodus story references water turning to blood, rivers running red, seas parting, and ground opening beneath the feet of rebels. While these events belong to the theological realm for many, scientists study their possible natural analogs. In the Nile, for example, seasonal algal blooms triggered by shifts in temperature. Rainfall and sediment flow can turn waters a deep red and drive fish to suffocate near the surface. Geological evidence of earthquakes along the Dead Sea transform Fault suggests that tremors capable of temporarily exposing land bridges or altering shorelines were not uncommon in antiquity. Such phenomena, while natural, could easily have been interpreted as divine interventions by ancient peoples who saw the world through a lens of awe and wonder. But perhaps the most intriguing scientific tools of all are genetic studies that track human migrations by analyzing the inherited markers passed through generations. In recent years, DNA extracted from ancient remains has painted a picture of the late Bronze Age that is far more dynamic than once believed. Populations across the eastern Mediterranean were on the move. People traveled, traded, intermarried, dispersed, and reassembled in new configurations. Egypt itself was a mosaic of ethnic groups, from Nubians in the south to Levantine communities in the delta. These migrations weren't rare, they were the pulse of the age. Geneticists studying remains from ancient Canaan found evidence of mixture between local populations and individuals with origins farther north and west. This genetic blending intensified during the centuries traditionally associated with the Exodus narrative. While DNA cannot confirm a specific biblical event, it does reveal a world where population shifts were the norm rather than the exception. And in a world full of constant movement, even a smaller, localized migration could inspire stories that would one day evolve into the sweeping narrative now known as Exodus. Archaeologists and scientists also examine clues left in ancient sediments, tiny grains of pollen carried by desert winds thousands of years ago. These grains record changes in climate, shifts in vegetation, and disruptions in agriculture. And in some periods of the late Bronze Age, the pollen record shows signs of drought, diminishing Nile floods, and agricultural decline. These environmental stresses could have triggered economic instability, social unrest, and migrations of both small and large groups. When societies strain under the weight of nature's pressures, people move. They leave. They seek new lands. And in their leaving, new stories are born, stories that might eventually be woven into the grand narrative of liberation and journey that Exodus represents. Science also turns its gaze toward material culture, the everyday objects people left behind. Pottery shards, for example, can be as revealing as historical texts. In the highlands of Canaan, a particular form of simple, undecorated pottery appears suddenly in many of the new settlements. Some scholars argue that this style lacks strong continuity with urban Canaanite ceramics, possibly indicating groups with different traditions. Others argue it represents a practical rural adaptation rather than a cultural marker. The debate continues, but the pottery itself remains silent, waiting for more context, more discoveries, more data to fill the gaps. In the desert regions associated with proposed Exodus routes, archaeologists search for signs of large encampments. Yet the lack of evidence for such encampments is not as conclusive as it seems. Nomadic groups, even relatively large ones, leave almost nothing behind. Their dwellings collapse into the earth, their hearths scatter to wind and stone. Their bones become dust. A transient population, even one numbering in the thousands, can pass through a region without leaving a meaningful archaeological trace, especially across millennia. And so the desert remains ambivalent, neither confirming nor denying. Another piece of the scientific puzzle comes from the study of ancient inscriptions. While inscriptions like the Meneptah stele hint at the existence of a group identified as Israel, their meaning is not straightforward. The stele does not describe an exodus. Rather, it acknowledges the presence of a people bearing that name somewhere in Canaan. But their sudden appearance in the historical record aligns with the same period where genetic, radiocarbon, and archaeological data all suggest social transformations. Something was happening. Groups were rising. Identities were forming. The world was shifting beneath the feet of entire civilizations. To some scholars, the Exodus may represent not a single event, but a tapestry woven from many multiple small migrations, memories of servitude, recollections of wandering, spiritual uprisings, and cultural evolutions. Over generations, these fragments would merge and solidify into a unified narrative. Science cannot confirm the story is written, but it supports the idea of movement, displacement, and the kind of cultural birth that could give rise to a foundational epic. And so the data speaks not in clear declarations, but in patterns and probabilities, in hints that align with the broader world of the late Bronze Age. Each discovery adds a pixel to the image. Each sample collected from the Earth contributes another brushstroke to a picture still forming, still incomplete. Some pixels brighten the story, others blur it. Some reinforce the possibility of historical memory behind the narrative. Others suggest reinterpretation, but perhaps the most striking revelation from the data is not what it proves or disproves. It's the reminder that history is rarely as neat as the stories we tell about it. Historical truth often lies at the intersection of memory, myth, and measurable fact. The Exodus may not rest entirely in archaeology or in science. It may rest in the shared memory of a people memory shaped by real migrations, real struggles, real transformations, and real experiences of liberation and identity forged under the weight of ancient empires. Science brings us closer to understanding the world from which the Exodus story emerged. It reveals a landscape in motion, a people adapting, a region undergoing profound upheaval. It shows us climate shifting, kingdoms falling, populations blending, and identities emerging. And in the midst of all that motion, it is not difficult to imagine a memory, a journey, a story that would grow into one of the most powerful narratives humanity has ever told. This chapter ends with a question that echoes through the deserts, through the ruins, through the fragments of pottery and the layers of soil and the silent genomes of ancient bones. If this was not the Exodus as written, then what was it? What event, what movement, what shared experience was powerful enough to seed a story that would endure for more than 3,000 years? The sands offer no clear answer, but the data continues to speak, whispering hints that the truth may be far more intricate, far more layered, and perhaps even more astonishing than the story we thought we knew. Chapter 5. The Enduring Legacy. Stories have the power to outlive the people who first told them. They outlive kingdoms, outlive empires, outlive entire civilizations. They pass from tongue to tongue, breath to breath, and in that passing they grow. They become more than memory. They become identity. And when we step back to look at the Exodus not as a single event, not as a debate, but as a narrative that has shaped cultures across continents and millennia, we discover a truth far greater than archaeology alone can reveal. We discover the legacy of a story that refuses to fade. The Exodus is not merely a tale of ancient roads and shifting sands. It is a narrative woven into the human condition, a narrative of bondage and freedom, loss and hope, despair and deliverance. Whether one views it as metaphor, myth, history, or all three entwined, its impact is immeasurable. And so in this final chapter, we leave the trenches of archaeology, the shards of pottery, the carbon-dated fragments, and turn instead to the resonance, the lasting echo of a story that continues to shape the world. Across centuries, countless generations have returned to the Exodus not simply to study it, but to feel it, to internalize it, to find themselves somewhere in its journey. And perhaps that is what gives the narrative its enduring power. It is not only a chronicle of what may have happened, it is a mirror for what always happens. Again and again, humanity finds itself yearning for liberation, struggling against forces greater than itself, searching for a promised land, whether that land is a physical place, a state of mind, or a new way of being. When ancient scribes first penned the story in its earliest forms, they captured more than a memory. They captured a pattern of oppression and resilience, of exile and return, of despair transformed into purpose. And that pattern became the heartbeat of entire cultures. Through festivals, prayers, songs, art, rituals, and teachings, the Exodus became not just a historical claim but a spiritual template, a guide, a reminder that the weight pressing on a people can be lifted, that the night can end, that the journey can begin again. The Exodus influenced civilizations more profoundly than most events that can be securely documented. It shaped legal codes, societal structures, liberation movements, philosophical frameworks, and moral visions. It became the centerpiece of liturgy and the backbone of identity for millions. The story is told every year around dinner tables, recited in solemn gatherings, retold in whispered reverence, reenacted in ceremony, and invoked during struggles for justice across the world. Entire movements for human rights, civil rights, and resistance against oppression have drawn strength from its imagery. The cry of "Let my people go" has traveled far beyond Egypt and Canaan. It has become a universal anthem. Even individuals who do not see the narrative as literal history still find meaning in its arc. They find in it a truth about the human journey, that life often leads through wildernesses, some vast and physical, others internal and unseen. That navigating uncertainty is part of what it means to grow. That freedom is rarely instant and often comes with sacrifice, perseverance, and transformation. The story's endurance is not dependent on the sand-encrusted artifacts that remain buried or lost. Its endurance lies in its emotional blueprint, carved into the collective memory of humanity. And yet, the historical question persists, not because it must be answered for the story to matter, but because curiosity is a deeply human trait. We want to know where myths begin. We want to know what kernel of truth lies beneath the layers of storytelling and tradition. But the absence of definitive archaeological proof does not diminish the narrative's significance. It simply invites us to look at history differently, to understand that stories sometimes carry truths that artifacts cannot capture. The Exodus narrative likely draws from numerous moments in ancient memory, times of enslavement, times of migration, times of cultural upheaval, a fragment of one journey, a memory of another, a whispered recollection passed down from a time before writing. Over generations, these fragments could have converged, shaped by the needs, fears, and hopes of the communities who carried them. The result was not just a chronological account, but a masterpiece of collective identity. And that identity is what survived. Long after kingdoms fell, long after cities crumbled, long after the sands covered every trace of the ancient world, the Exodus remained. It was preserved in songs when libraries burned. It was recited when temples were destroyed. It was kept alive in hearts, in gatherings, in quiet moments of reflection, and in the rituals of countless generations. The power of the story has always been in its retelling. The beauty of the Exodus is that it becomes personal. Each generation finds its own meaning in it. For some, it is a prophecy fulfilled. For others, it is a metaphor for spiritual awakening. For others still, it is a historical puzzle waiting to be solved. But for all, it remains a journey from darkness to light, from captivity to freedom, from fear to trust, from wandering to arrival. As we reflect on this legacy, we see how the Exodus shaped not only ancient religion, but also the wider human imagination. Literature, art, music, film, and philosophy are filled with echoes of this narrative. From poems inscribed on ancient tablets to modern stories told on glowing screens, the same arc reappears. The oppressed longing for freedom, the great escape from tyranny, the perilous journey across an unforgiving landscape, the transformation of identity, and the ultimate hope of reaching a promised horizon. And yet, for all its reach, the Exodus remains an intimate story, a story of families, of communities, of individuals wrestling with their pasts, seeking a future they could not yet see. It is the story of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. People who walked through wildernesses, not knowing what awaited them. People who carried their fears, doubts, joys, memories, and dreams through a journey that would define not only themselves, but entire cultures that would one day look back and call it foundational. As we close this long exploration through text, through sand, through evidence and absence, through memory and science, it becomes clear that the true power of the Exodus lies not in proving it, but in understanding it. Understanding how a narrative so ancient could still speak to us today. understanding how it could be both historical and symbolic, both factual and transcendent, understanding how it could endure where countless other stories were lost. And so we arrive at the final reflection. The Exodus continues to matter because we continue to need it, not necessarily as a map of ancient migration, but as a map of the human soul, a reminder that liberation, whatever it means in our time, is possible. And that journeys begin with a single step, that wildernesses, no matter how long, eventually end. And that hope, even when buried beneath centuries of sand, can rise again. The real Exodus may or may not be preserved in stone or inscription, but it is preserved in something far more resilient, the human longing for freedom, the human need for meaning, the human capacity to endure. And in that sense, the Exodus is not just a story of the past. It is a story that continues every time someone rises from oppression, every time a community seeks justice, every time an individual takes the brave step toward a new beginning. The legacy of the Exodus lives in these moments. It lives in the belief that transformation is possible. This narrative, whether historical, metaphorical, or woven from threads of both, has shaped humanity for over 3,000 years. And its journey is far from over. As new discoveries emerge, as new interpretations arise, as new generations read the story anew, the Exodus will continue to evolve. It will continue to inspire, to challenge, to provoke, to comfort. It will continue to remind us that the path from bondage to freedom, though ancient, is timeless. And so we step back from the sands, from the ruins, from the ancient roads and weathered mountains, and we leave the past where it rests. But we carry with us the story it gave birth to, a story that has already outlived worlds and will likely outlive ours. This is the enduring legacy of the Exodus, a story that refuses to be forgotten, a journey that continues within history, within culture, within the hearts of all who hear it and see themselves somewhere along its path. May its echo continue to guide, to challenge, and to illuminate long after the final words of this chapter fade into silence.